The market hall of Flaxborough, an edifice designed in the late 19th century to resemble both a railway station and a chapel, depending on which side one approached, was serving its evening duty as host to the Rotary Club's annual dinner. The civic worthies, mercantile strivers, and a scattering of earnest professionals had assembled with their spouses or, in one case of notorious bravery, with someone else's spouse to perform that most solemn ritual of provincial respectability to congratulate themselves upon being the sort of people who attended Rotary dinners. A faint smell of boiled cabbage had somehow survived the kitchen's ambitious efforts with consommé. At the high table, Alderman Grope, whose chest possessed the same breadth as his conscience did elasticity, tapped his spoon against a glass and embarked on a speech about service above self, which most present interpreted as a reminder that subs were overdue. It was at the precise moment when Mrs. Pargeter, treasurer of the Inner Wheel, and known scourge of waitresses insufficiently attentive with water jugs, adjusted her lorgnette for a more penetrating inspection of the soufflé that the interruption occurred. The club secretary, a brisk man named Hargreaves, whose hair was parted with the geometry of a railway junction, stood and cleared his throat with such formality that the audience assumed he was about to introduce the raffle. Instead, he raised aloft a small, dark object, delicately pinched between finger and thumb. This, he announced, was discovered in the ballot box, prepared for the draw. Polite interest wavered round the tables, though it brightened considerably when he added, "It is most certainly not a ticket." The object was revealed to be a rather ornate brass key, its bow set with a chipped piece of coloured glass that aspired to look like ruby. It was heavy, old-fashioned, and judging from the mutterings of place in a town where modern locks were largely of the discount ironmongery persuasion. Alderman Grope frowned mightily. Mrs. Pargeter whispered that it looked like something from a foreign hotel. Mr. Hargreaves, flushed with his own drama, insisted that the matter be investigated before any raffle could proceed. It was perhaps the only occasion in Flaxborough history when the prospect of winning a basket of tinned goods and port was put on hold in favour of mystery. The key was passed down the high table like a sacrament of unease. Several Rotarians examined it, each with the air of being well acquainted with such artefacts, though in truth none was. At last it reached the town's solicitor, Mr. Pythock, who held it gingerly and muttered, "Looks more like evidence than property." This pronouncement caused a ripple of apprehension. The word evidence in Flaxborough carried with it unwholesome associations, newspaper reports, police constables at doors, and the possibility of one's name being linked with something unfortunate. It was, therefore, with a certain collective relief that someone suggested Inspector Purbright be consulted. He was not present, for Purbright did not belong to Rotary, nor in fact did he belong to any society that involved raffles, guest speakers on overseas sanitation schemes, or enforced clapping of speeches. But his absence only added to the sense of officialdom that his name conjured. The key, and the awkwardness it represented, must naturally be delivered to him in the morning. Meanwhile the raffle proceeded with chastened enthusiasm, though the winning of a foot spar by the mayor's wife did not restore quite the gaiety expected. Conversation throughout the remainder of the evening circled endlessly around the key, whose it might be, why it had been placed in the box, and whether it ought to have been cleaned before being handled so freely. In one corner, the Reverend Toop, a man of theological breadth but personal thinness, remarked to his neighbour that mischief was always possible in any town, even ours, to which his neighbour, a coal merchant with 3 daughters seeking advantageous matches, replied that it was more likely someone's little joke. Yet the unease remained. In Flaxborough, practical jokes had a tiresome way of shading into scandal, and scandal, when once alight, was the one flame that no civic dinner could extinguish. As the Rotarians parted, stepping carefully into the damp, cobbled square outside the hall, Several glanced about as though the key's original owner might be watching from some convenient shadow. None saw anything more sinister than a stray dog gnawing a paper bag. But then, as Inspector Purbright would later observe, Flaxborough had always been rather better at hiding its secrets than revealing them. Morning in Flaxborough began, as it so often did, with the faint clang of milk bottles, the odour of bacon retreating through kitchen windows, and the comforting knowledge that little of consequence was likely to occur before midday. Yet this Tuesday proved an exception. By the time the church clock had struck 10, the curious business of the brass key had already moved from the market hall's panelled confines into every tea shop, grocer's queue, and hairdresser's chair the town could provide. The first version of the story came, naturally, from Mrs. Pargeter. She had barely left the hall the previous night before rehearsing the recital of her discovery, she insisted, though it had been Mr. Hargreaves who held the thing aloft. By breakfast, she was telling her maid that the key was encrusted with what might have been blood. By 11 at Mrs. Clegg's tea-room, she was holding forth to a fascinated audience about how it had fallen from the ballot box with a clank that echoed like doom. Mrs. Clegg, who had herself been at the dinner, allowed this account to flourish unchecked, for gossip was the best sweetener she could offer with her rather leathery scones. Meanwhile, the Reverend Toop, when buttonholed by a parishioner outside the greengrocer's, declared the key to be a symbolic warning, perhaps directed at the town for its sins of pride and materialism. As Flaxborough was a place where materialism largely expressed itself in the purchase of slightly better tinned salmon for Sunday teas, his warning caused more amusement than repentance. In the snug of the Railway Arms, a different interpretation held sway. Old Mr. Blount, a retired railway porter with a moustache that might once have been martial, pronounced that the key was certainly foreign and probably stolen. He added, in tones of relish, that it was quite possibly from a safe, the kind containing currency. This prospect appealed to his audience of pensioners who enjoyed imagining robberies as long as they occurred well away from their own pensions. Such conjectures travelled fast, sometimes doubling in flamboyance within the distance of a single street. By mid-afternoon, it was generally accepted, at least among the younger clerks of the town, that the key must open a chest of smuggled jewels buried somewhere in the crypt beneath St. Swithin's. The fact that St. Swithin's crypt contained little more than dry bones and damp stone did nothing to restrain their excitement. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was quietly apprised of events in his office by Sergeant Malley, who presented the matter with the slightly overdone gravity of one who knew it might be laughed at. The key, wrapped in brown paper, lay on Purbright's desk as if ashamed of its notoriety. Purbright regarded it with mild curiosity, turning it over between forefinger and thumb. It was old-fashioned, certainly, but not particularly exotic. The chipped red glass in its bow might, in another light, have been mistaken for the plastic of a child's toy. "Remarkable," said Purbright at last, "how an object can gain such consequence simply by being out of place. If it had been in a drawer at home, no one would have given it a thought." Malley, encouraged to relax, ventured that it was probably a prank. He suggested a schoolboy, though the practical difficulty of introducing such an item into a ballot box without detection made this less than convincing. Later that day, Purbright left the station to walk through the market square. He noted with quiet amusement how conversations hushed as he passed, only to resume in more animated tones once he was safely beyond earshot. He paused at Mrs. Pargeter's tea-table, summoned, in truth, rather than being invited to endure her version of the key's unveiling. She related it in a tone of mingled horror and triumph, with frequent glances at surrounding tables to ensure they were listening as well. Purbright nodded politely, occasionally asking the sort of mild questions that appeared designed merely to keep her talking. Did she think it had been deliberately placed? Had anyone seemed unduly excited when it was discovered? Mrs. Pargeter, who lived for such interrogations, was only too ready to recall that Alderman Grope had gone rather red, and that Mr. Hargreaves had been unusually flustered. These details were delivered with the weight of eyewitness testimony in a capital trial. When Purbright eventually rose, having endured a cake that could easily have been used as ballast, he carried with him more of the town's impressions than of its facts. Yet he was content, for in Flaxborough facts came disguised in gossip, the art lay impatiently stripping away the embroidery. Elsewhere, the ripple of unease was working in subtler ways. Mr. Pethock, the solicitor, had found himself distracted in chambers that morning, repeatedly examining the brass key as though it might suddenly declare its owner. He even considered placing a notice in the Chronicle key found Apply Police Station, but thought better of it. Such an advertisement might invite embarrassment for a client, and clients' embarrassments were, after all, the solicitor's bread and butter. By evening, when the street lamps flickered on and the last buses lumbered away toward the outlying villages, Flaxborough had settled into that peculiar combination of reassurance and excitement that comes only when a mystery is too trivial to be dangerous but too odd to be ignored. Housewives told their husbands of it over supper. Husbands, in turn, carried the tale to pubs, where it gained weight like a snowball rolling downhill. In one parlour, an elderly widow prayed earnestly that the key might not unlock her late husband's bureau, which contained nothing more scandalous than outdated catalogues, but which she nevertheless felt might reveal something best left private. In another, a pair of brothers speculated whether the key belonged to the old brewery vaults, and if so, whether casks of unclaimed ale might still linger there. Thus the town reacted not with alarm, but with the delighted vigilance of people whose lives were ordinarily predictable to the point of tedium. For once, Flaxborough possessed a story. And Inspector Purbright, returning quietly to his modest lodgings that evening, was already considering not so much the key itself as the motives of whoever had contrived its appearance. Objects, he reflected, seldom strayed into ballot boxes without assistance. That assistance was likely human and therefore interesting. Inspector Purbright began the following morning with what he privately considered one of his most valuable duties: listening. The art of police work in Flaxborough rarely demanded pursuits or revolvers, but it did require the kind of patient ear that could endure half an hour of reminiscence about a cousin's lumbago in order to catch the single, unguarded phrase that revealed something significant. His first port of call was the office of Mr. Hargreaves, the Rotary secretary, who, by virtue of being the man to reveal the brass key, now carried an air of reluctant notoriety. Hargreaves's premises overlooked the square and smelt faintly of ink, paper, and the moral rectitude of a man who prided himself on balancing ledgers to the halfpenny. He received Purbright with a mixture of relief and anxiety, rather like a boy confessing to a schoolmaster that he had found a frog in the classroom, but had not put it there. "I couldn't possibly say how it came into the box, Inspector," he explained, adjusting his spectacles with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "I always supervise the folding of the tickets myself. Quite methodical, no room for irregularities." Purbright inclined his head sympathetically. Of course, it must have been puzzling. Hargreaves took this encouragement as a signal to catalogue, in excruciating detail, the entire procedure of raffle preparation, the selling of tickets, the numbering, the folding, the shaking of the box, with all due decorum. Purbright let the words flow like water over a stone. Somewhere amid the procedural self-congratulation might be lodged a pebble of truth. When Hargreaves paused for breath, Purbright inserted a mild question. "Did anyone else have access to the box before the draw?" The secretary frowned, considering. Well, yes. It was left on the treasurer's table before dinner. But it was sealed, or at least the lid was closed. I cannot say it was sealed in any binding sense. The inspector's only response was a small nod. To Hargreaves, it was a sign of understanding. To Purbright, it was an acknowledgment that here lay opportunity enough for any determined mischief-maker. After leaving the office, Purbright made his way to Alderman Grope's drapery establishment, a building whose gaudy window displays of shawls and nylons attempted unsuccessfully to disguise the gloom within. The alderman, a man whose waistcoat buttons appeared to wage daily battle against his meals, greeted him with a warmth born of nervousness. "My dear Inspector, this wretched business about the key most disturbing, quite the sort of thing to bring ridicule upon a respectable gathering." "Indeed," said Purbright mildly. "You seemed somewhat put out at the time." Grope's eyes widened, then narrowed with defensive dignity. "Merely startled, I assure you. Any man might redden a trifle, finding himself connected with such an odd incident." "You know how tongues wag," Purbright agreed, adding with deliberate casualness, "You've no idea what the key might open." The alderman gave a laugh that was rather too hearty, the sort of laugh that hoped to drown its own echo. "My dear fellow, if I possessed such an object, I should use it on my cellar door. The Council Burgundy is scarcely safe with my nephew about." He chuckled again, though without any of the sparkle that usually accompanied his humour at Rotary dinners. The inspector allowed the remark to stand and asked no more. People often revealed most when their words were left dangling like laundry in a gust. His inquiries next brought him to Mr. Pythock, the solicitor, who maintained chambers that smelled faintly of dust, ink, and the quiet accumulation of secrets. Pythock was dry in manner, precise in dress, and gave the impression of regarding every conversation as a potential billable consultation. "I suppose," he told Purbright, "that the item may well belong to a client, but professional propriety forbids me to speculate aloud." "Quite," said Purbright. "But I would like to know whether it resembles anything you have encountered in your practice." Pythock pursed his lips, examined the key, and said at last, "It is of a type associated with older locks, estate houses perhaps, private cabinets, things meant not to be opened in a hurry." His glance flicked upward, cool and assessing. "You will, of course, understand that I cannot be more specific." Purbright understood perfectly. The solicitor's living depended upon his ability to appear to know more than he would ever say. From Pythock's office, Purbright walked to St. Swithin's vicarage. Reverend Toop welcomed him in with an eagerness that suggested spiritual interpretation might be required. It was surely a sign, the clergyman declared, after the briefest recital of facts, a reminder that our worldly concerns, raffles, banquets, subs are trivial beside the great mysteries. Purbright, who suspected the Almighty had little interest in Rotary raffles, nevertheless let Toop's reflections unfold. They yielded nothing of use, save perhaps the revelation that the vicar enjoyed being consulted by the police, which was in itself a small clue to character. By late afternoon, the inspector returned to his office. The interviews, while bland on the surface, had produced a handful of irregularities. Hargreaves's nervousness, Grope's overdone dismissal, Pythock's studied restraint. None amounted to more than a smudge upon a page, but Purbright knew such smudges, when examined together, could sometimes sketch a picture. He set the key down upon his desk and regarded it steadily. It was a small object, but in Flaxborough small objects often unlocked very human cupboards of embarrassment. It was unlikely to have been placed in the raffle box by accident, even less likely that it was without meaning. Someone, somewhere, had wished it to be found. And though the town was content to speculate with gusto, Purbright suspected that behind the laughter and embroidery of rumour lay a more personal unease. The trick now was not to chase facts, but to listen more closely still to the inflections, the blushes, the pauses of those who spoke too much or too little. The mystery of the key, he reflected, was less about what it opened than about whom it unsettled. The business of a town, even one as proud of its tranquillity as Flaxborough, is to establish order where disorder threatens to take root. The disorder in question, the small brass key with its chipped mock jewel, was of such modest dimensions that the urge to pin responsibility upon someone became all the more pressing. A proper culprit, or at least a convenient explanation, was required, lest Flaxborough be thought vulnerable to vagabondry and mystery. It was no surprise, therefore, that before the week was out, certain members of the council had formed a consensus. At the mayor's parlour room, whose burgundy drapes and heavy mahogany furniture gave the illusion of grandeur rather than the reality, the question was solemnly debated. Alderman Grope presided, puffing out his chest and speaking with an authority that had less to do with his position than with his ability to drown others by sheer volume. "The facts are plain," he declared, adjusting his watch chain with judicial gravity. "The ballot box was interfered with, the key appeared, and we must ask who would benefit from such disruption. The answer is obviously young Harbottle." There was a murmur of assent. Young Harbottle, a clerk in the surveyor's office, had achieved a minor notoriety by writing light-hearted squibs for the Chronicle under the nom de plume Civis. His lampoons of the council's deliberations, though mild, had stung the alderman, unused as they were to being regarded with levity. "Yes, Harbottle," repeated Grope, with the satisfaction of a man convinced by his own argument. Always scribbling, always making a nuisance. It would be just the sort of prank he'd contrive, thinking it clever. The mayor, a courteous but weary man whose primary ambition was to keep civic affairs from collapsing into embarrassment, nodded gravely. "Perhaps," he said, "we should invite Inspector Purbright to examine this possibility." Thus it was that Purbright found himself, the next afternoon, politely asked to consider the case against Harbottle. He listened with his usual mild expression as Grope outlined the theory. "It seems to me, Inspector," the alderman concluded, "that we are dealing not with a crime, but with a juvenile jest, a discourtesy to this body certainly, but hardly requiring your full professional attention." Purbright inclined his head, as if acknowledging a sound point. Yet his eyes, faintly amused, suggested he was more occupied with the nature of Grope's eagerness than with Harbottle's alleged mischief. The young clerk himself, when interviewed, proved guileless in manner. He was a lanky fellow with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, and he received Purbright in lodgings that smelt faintly of boiled cabbage and ink. "A prank," Harbottle repeated when the inspector mentioned the matter. "Oh, they'd like to think so, wouldn't they? Makes them feel safer blaming me, but I've never even seen the key. And besides," here he gave a shy, slightly conspiratorial, grimy joke made of words. "Inspector, not brass." Purbright regarded him steadily. "Did you attend the Rotary dinner?" "No, sir. They wouldn't have me. My subscription would be better spent on coal, and they know it. Besides, they don't much. Like their speeches appearing in rhyme the following week." This seemed plausible enough. Harbottle's exclusion alone made it unlikely he could have slipped the key into the box unseen. Yet rumours persisted, for nothing satisfied Flaxborough's appetite for order quite so well as a scapegoat. The gossip ran its course through the town with predictable flourish. At Mrs. Clegg's tea-room, it was asserted that Harbottle had once been seen carrying a bunch of old keys. At the Railway Arms, someone recalled that he had made a joke about unlocking secrets in one of his verses. In the Snug, this was quickly translated into certainty. Harbottle had confessed in writing, no less. Purbright heard all this with the same patience he reserved for local reports of burglars seen in shadows that turned out to be washing lines. He noted only the eagerness with which suspicion had fastened upon the young man, as though by naming him the town could fold the incident neatly into its drawer of harmless follies. Yet one detail troubled him. The aldermen's insistence on Harbottle's guilt seemed a little too hearty, as though they relished the opportunity to discipline an inconvenient critic. Such relish, Purbright knew, often concealed anxiety. When he returned to his office, he placed the key once more upon his desk and studied it as though it might confess something under silent scrutiny. Its weight and tarnish suggested years of quiet service. It was not, he felt certain, the kind of object a young clerk would stumble across and decide to plant for amusement. It had the air of belonging or being missed somewhere by someone reluctant to admit the loss. That evening, as he walked home along the high street, Purbright reflected upon the council's haste. Town dignitaries did not usually expend their indignation on trifles unless trifles threatened to grow larger. The real question was not who had placed the key in the box, but why the prospect of its origin so unsettled them. The streets were quiet, lamps glistening upon cobbles, slick with drizzle. In parlour windows, curtains half-drawn revealed families at supper, gossip still passing with relish from one household to another. Flaxborough was settling, as always, into its night-time hum of ordinariness. Yet under that calm, Purbright sensed the faint tremor of something less ordinary, an unease that could not be so easily folded away as the alderman hoped. Young Harbottle would, no doubt, continue to serve as the convenient suspect for a while, but Purbright, unruffled and quietly attentive, was certain the truth lay elsewhere. And when truth lay elsewhere in Flaxborough, it had a habit of pointing to places where respectability grew thin and secrets like mildew clung beneath the surface. The neatness of Harbottle's scapegoat might have contented a less patient policeman, but Inspector Purbright's instinct leaned elsewhere. He let the theory rest, as one allows a poorly baked pudding to cool, knowing it would collapse under its own insufficiency. And so he kept his eyes and ears open for the sort of small, overlooked thing that often proved more eloquent than a confession. The oddity presented itself not in a courtroom, nor in a council chamber, but in Mrs. Poole's drapery shop, where Purbright happened one damp afternoon to step in for a pair of gloves. The assistant, a young woman given to eager chatter, remarked that Alderman Grope had been all of a fluster 2 days before, having called in to purchase ribbon. Ribbon, she said, was not the usual concern of gentlemen aldermen, unless for the benefit of wives or daughters. Yet Grope, by all accounts, had bought it in haste, and had failed, most unusually, to haggle over the price. It might have been nothing, and Purbright treated it as such outwardly, but he noted the peculiarity. Grope was widely known for turning every transaction into a test of endurance for shopkeepers. That he had parted with coins too easily suggested a mind distracted or a conscience busy elsewhere. Later that week, the inspector attended a small luncheon at the Crown Hotel, where he found himself placed beside Mrs. Pargeter. Between complaints about the soup's lack of salt and the indecency of modern skirts, she made a remark about the Rotary dinner. Of course, she said, Alderman Grope dropped his serviette when the key was passed along. Quite careless. I thought at the time how odd it was that he always handles his linen like an archbishop, his chalice. Purbright made no show of interest, but his memory registered the detail. Grope had blushed, laughed too heartily, and now, it seemed, had fumbled at the table like a novice. Such small slips in the inspector's experience tended to betray a larger unease. Another triviality came to light at the police station itself. Sergeant Malley, riffling through the lost property cupboard, produced an item handed in by a child the previous month, a small brass escutcheon plate, clearly once belonging to a lock. Its age and pattern bore a curious resemblance to the bow of the mysterious key. The sergeant dismissed it as coincidence after all, The town was full of discarded odds and ends, but Purbright, turning it thoughtfully in his fingers, allowed that coincidences in Flaxborough often had social rather than statistical causes. The inspector did not rush to conclusions. Instead, he returned to his quiet observations of the town's leading figures. Grope, outwardly robust and jovial, seemed just slightly more irritable than usual, snapping at an assistant in his shop and fumbling with his pocket watch when approached by customers. Hargreaves, for his part, continued to talk about the key whenever an ear could be found, but his manner had shifted from anxiety to self-importance, as though the whole matter were a stage upon which he had played the starring role. It was during a walk across the square one morning that Purbright encountered Harbottle again. The young man raised his hat and, with a wry smile, remarked, "I see I am still the villain of choice." "Rumours have a way of lingering," Purbright replied amiably. "You need only outlast them." Harbottle chuckled, though without much mirth. "If only the aldermen took so long to forget their own schemes as they do to remember my supposed ones." The inspector let the comment pass, but he stored it carefully. It was often from the mouths of the unguarded and the disgruntled that the truest hints emerged. That evening, at home, with his lamp burning low, Purbright laid the key, the escutcheon plate, and his notebook upon the table. He studied them in silence. The plate might once have been fixed to a cabinet, a chest, or perhaps an old bureau. The key, with its ornamental bow, suggested something meant not for mere utility, but for show and heirloom, perhaps, or the lock to some piece of furniture bearing sentimental weight. And if that was so, the question was not how it had come to be in a raffle box, but why someone had wanted it there, where it could hardly fail to attract notice. It was this deliberate element, the calculated placing, that held Purbright's attention. Mischief might conceal, but this felt like a gesture intended to reveal, a signal directed at someone in that hall, perhaps at more than one person. The inspector thought again of Grope's flushed face, his serviette tumbling, his unusual readiness to part with money for ribbon. These were trifles, yes, but trifles often formed the dust upon which footprints became visible. The following day, Purbright walked past Grope's shop again, pausing discreetly at the window. Amid the shawls and nylons stood a small writing desk, newly displayed. It was of no particular beauty, though its brass fittings had the same dull gleam as the key. A card announced it as "From the late Mr. Havelock's estate special offer." Purbright entered, feigning idle curiosity. Grope bustled over, too quick, too insistent, extolling the desk's virtues in a tone that sounded defensive. The inspector ran a finger along the lock, noting its absence. There was a neat, square hole where once it had sat, and faint scratches about the edge where something had been prized away. "I've seen it like in old houses," Purbright remarked casually. Quite so," Grope replied, wiping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool air. "A bargain, Inspector. You won't find another so solid." But Purbright was not in the market for a desk. He thanked the alderman politely and withdrew, leaving behind a shopkeeper whose smile was more strained than ever. Out in the street, Purbright reflected that he now had two fragments of the same puzzle, a key designed to fit such a lock, and an escutcheon plate that could well have adorned that very desk. Together, they suggested not only connection, but intention. The alderman had been swift to lay blame upon Harbottle, yet it was Grope whose actions grew increasingly clumsy, whose laughter rang a little too loudly, whose possessions appeared to bear the scars of hurried concealment. The inspector did not yet allow himself to draw conclusions. In Flaxborough, it was wise to resist the temptation of tidy answers, but he felt, with quiet certainty, that the brass key had not been tossed into the ballot box as a prank. It had been placed there for the eyes of someone particular, and the small, odd details, the serviette, the ribbon, the desk without its lock, were beginning to whisper whose eyes those were. The curious matter of the key and the desk might have remained a neat, private puzzle for Inspector Purbright, had not the town itself, with its inexhaustible appetite for embroidery, widened the circle of interest. Gossip, as he knew well, seldom contracted, it only multiplied, sprouting fresh limbs until even the quietest households found themselves tangentially involved. Within a few days, 2 new threads had reached Purbright's desk. The first came by way of Mrs. Pargeter, who considered it her civic duty to report all trifles dressed as revelations. She entered the police station unannounced, bustling past the constable at the front desk as though she carried an urgent proclamation of war. In tones of relish, she declared that she had discovered something most peculiar about Mrs. Grope, the alderman's wife. According to Mrs. Pargeter, the lady had been seen in the company of Mr. Havelock's niece, one Miss Lucy Felsham, outside the auction rooms not a fortnight earlier. They had been conversing in what she described as a decidedly conspiratorial huddle. That Lucy had been executor to her late uncle's modest estate, and that the desk now displayed in Grope's window had come from that very sale, required no leaps of deduction to stitch into a pattern of suspicion. Purbright listened without commitment, thanked her with his customary civility, and allowed her to depart gratified. Yet the mention of Lucy Felsham remained. He recalled her vaguely from church fetes, a tall young woman with a habit of listening more than speaking, and eyes that seemed to see further than politeness required. The second thread arrived from the opposite end of town. Old Mr. Blount, the retired railway porter, had waylaid Sergeant Malley outside the station and insisted that the mysterious key belonged to the cellar doors of the defunct Red Lion brewery. Malley, amused, repeated the claim to Purbright later that evening. Purbright, rather than dismissing it outright, asked mildly when the brewery had last been opened. "Not since the bankruptcy," Malley replied, "and that's a dozen years ago at least." "Bankruptcy," Purbright murmured. "A curious word, Sergeant. It so often conceals more than it explains." He resolved, therefore, to extend his inquiries to the fringes of the tale. His next call was upon Miss Felsham, whom he found at her small cottage on the edge of town. She received him with a calm politeness that seemed to anticipate his arrival. "Yes, Inspector, I oversaw the auction," she confirmed, when he asked about the estate. "My uncle's affairs were sadly reduced. There was little enough to dispose of." Purbright glanced around the room. It was tidy, almost severely so, with few personal possessions beyond some books and a china figurine of a shepherdess. The absence of clutter, he thought, often told as much as its presence. And the writing desk? "A relic," she said with faint disdain. "My uncle clung to it, though it was worth little. Alderman Grope purchased it cheaply. He seemed very eager, I remember." Her tone, though mild, carried a trace of irony. Purbright noticed how she folded her hands tightly together after speaking, as if bracing herself. "Was there anything unusual about the desk?" he asked. Miss Felsham hesitated a moment too long. "Only that my uncle kept it locked even when empty. He disliked anyone meddling with his things." That admission, dropped so carefully, drew a quiet light in Purbright's eyes. He thanked her and turned the conversation to safer ground, leaving her with a sense of having disclosed more than intended. His next inquiry took him to the derelict brewery. The Red Lion stood at the far end of a cobbled lane, its broken windows like blind eyes staring into emptiness. The great wooden doors sagged upon their hinges, and weeds sprouted from cracks in the courtyard. A boy with a bicycle watched curiously as the inspector examined the padlocks, which were modern, rust-flecked, and utterly unsuited to the ornate brass key upon Purbright's desk. So much for Mr. Blount's conviction. Yet the visit was not wasted, for Purbright valued the elimination of possibilities as much as the confirmation of them. In the evenings, the town's conversations grew even more inventive. Some now claimed the key belonged to a chest of letters, others to a parish strongbox lost during the war. At the Railway Arms, the theory had ripened that smuggled spirits were concealed beneath St. Swithin's vestry, and that the key was the work of a secret society of smugglers' descendants. Purbright, hearing this second-hand, allowed himself a flicker of amusement. He knew Flaxborough's citizens were less suited to smuggling than to the careful concealment of unpaid accounts. Still, gossip had its uses. From the chatter he gleaned a sharper sense of whose names recurred with discomfort. Grope, always, and now Miss Felsham too. It was enough to broaden the field of his inquiries, and that in itself was progress. He returned at length to Grope's shop, this time without pretence of purchase. The alderman, perspiring behind his counter, was less effusive than before. Purbright, in his quiet manner, asked about the auction. "A trifling matter," Inspector Grope replied, wiping his brow. "An old desk, a few odds and ends. I paid a fair price. Nothing more to be said." "Except," Purbright remarked gently, "that the desk had a lock missing." Grope stiffened. "A common thing, furniture in such condition. Hardly worth notice." "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but sometimes trifles are noticed." He left the alderman frowning after him, the words hanging in the air like faint smoke. That night Purbright walked slowly home, reflecting upon the widening circle. The brass key had begun as a curiosity. It was now tethered by threads to Grope, to Miss Felsham, to a desk once locked and now suspiciously unlocked. The town, in its eagerness to thrust Harbottle forward as culprit, had overlooked the subtler drama taking shape behind its shop windows and parlour curtains. The inspector did not hasten the pace. He allowed matters to unfold, as they always did in Flaxborough, by degrees of gossip and accident. Yet he sensed, with the calm intuition of experience, that the key was not merely a relic. It was a signal, perhaps even a warning, deliberately placed where it could not be ignored. And if that were true, then the riddle was only just beginning to open. The widening of the field might have continued indefinitely. Flaxborough was generous with speculation had not a second incident occurred to stir the matter from curiosity to genuine disquiet. It arrived in the form of a telephone call to the police station one grey morning when drizzle blurred the high street and the pavements shone like wet slate. The call was from Mrs. Grope, who spoke in a tone sharpened by indignation. Someone, she declared, had broken into her husband's drapery shop during the night. Nothing of value seemed to be missing, no cash, no silks, not even hosiery, but the little writing desk purchased from the Havelock estate had been forced open. The lock, already absent, had been roughly gouged further and its drawers rifled. Purbright arrived at the shop within the hour, Sergeant Malley in tow. The scene bore all the marks of amateur violence. Splinters of wood clung to the floor, the drawers hung askew, and a faint smell of oil from a lantern lingered in the air. Grope, red-faced and perspiring, blustered about ruffians and vagrants, declaring that it was the inevitable consequence of modern laxity in punishment. Purbright listened politely, examining the damage. The desk had been searched with determination, if not skill. A scrap of paper lay on the floor, torn from one of the drawers, bearing nothing more illuminating than an old invoice for haberdashery. Yet the very emptiness of the search suggested intent. Whoever had broken in had been looking for something particular, not plunder. Was there anything of importance kept in the desk? Purbright asked mildly. Certainly not, Grope replied too quickly. Mere papers, odds and ends. The thing is barely fit for firewood. His wife, seated nearby with a face like tightened linen, interjected in cool tones that she had told her husband at the time it was foolish to buy old furniture of doubtful quality. Purbright, glancing at her, noted the firmness of her gaze, the faint tremor of distaste directed more at her husband than at the intruder. The inspector allowed the alderman to thunder about burglars, making careful notes that recorded nothing of the bluster, but much of the pauses between it. Then, without comment, he asked Mally to make inquiries among those who had seen or heard movement in the square during the night. By evening, the sergeant had returned with 2 accounts. A lamplighter had noticed a figure slipping through the shadows around midnight, tall and quick-footed, though the drizzle and distance obscured detail. A milkman, delivering at dawn, had remarked upon the unusual state of the desk in the shop window, its drawers gaping open. Neither account was precise enough to point to anyone, but together they confirmed the intrusion. Word spread, as it always did. By noon the next day, every tea table in Flaxborough was buzzing with theories. To some, the break-in proved that Harbottle, having failed to gain satisfaction from planting the key, had now turned to burglary. Others preferred the notion of long-concealed treasure hidden within the desk, perhaps love letters or incriminating documents, stolen away in the night. At the Railway Arms, the prevailing theory was that foreign agents had infiltrated the town and were using the Rotary raffle to pass coded signals. Purbright, for his part, considered none of these conclusions. What interested him was not the intrusion itself, but the unease it spread among those already entangled in the mystery. When he called upon Miss Felsham again, he found her uncharacteristically restless. She confessed to being troubled by the news, though she insisted she had no idea what could have been sought in her uncle's old desk. Yet her eyes, when she said it, shifted ever so slightly toward the floor, as if unwilling to rest upon his. The inspector's patience did not falter. He asked no further questions, merely thanked her for her time and left, knowing that silence often compelled reflection more effectively than interrogation. It was in the following days that he began to notice other small signs. Hargreaves, the secretary, now avoided mention of the key altogether, as though wishing to detach himself from the story he had once so eagerly owned. Pythock, the solicitor, was seen in earnest conversation with Grope outside the council offices, their faces grave, their words muffled. And Mrs. Grope, encountered in passing at a draper's counter, remarked with pointed precision that households can seldom endure secrets without consequence. The town itself reacted with equal parts delight and anxiety. Children dared one another to peer into the broken shop window. Housewives warned of burglars at large. Tradesmen muttered about insurance premiums. Yet beneath the chatter was something subtler, a sense that the mystery was no longer merely entertainment, but had become, in some concealed way, dangerous. Purbright, sitting in his office one evening, arranged the elements in his mind. First, a key deliberately placed in a raffle box where it must draw attention. Second, a desk purchased in haste by Grope, stripped of its lock, now violently opened in the night. Third, the tremors of unease in Miss Felsham and the evasions of Grope himself. It was too neat to be accidental. Someone was seeking to reveal a matter long concealed, though whether by planting or by prizing, the motive was not yet clear. He lit his pipe and gazed through the office window into the misty glow of the lamp-post outside. The drizzle blurred the outlines of the square, softening the edges of shops and houses, as though the town itself wished to keep its secrets blurred. But Purbright knew secrets never stayed, so they condensed like the mist until one was forced to wipe the pain and see clearly. The break-in at Grope's shop had shifted the affair from trivial curiosity to undeniable mischief. The Rotary Club riddle was no longer a matter of gossip alone. Someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, was determined to bring to light a truth that others strove to bury. And the inspector, with his unhurried courtesy and patient watchfulness, intended to be there when the fog cleared. Inspector Purbright, though courteous in his dealings, had never been hurried by appearances. He knew that the recent breaking had jolted the town into fresh excitement, yet he preferred to treat it as an opportunity for quiet thought rather than clamorous action. The chatter of Flaxborough would run its course. His task was to listen beneath it, where motives hummed like wires behind plaster. That evening, seated in his modest sitting-room with a lamp casting mellow light upon familiar volumes, he let the day's fragments arrange themselves, the brass key planted conspicuously in the raffle box, the desk hurriedly bought, shorn of its lock, and now ransacked in the night. The alderman's hasty explanations, his wife's pointed froideur, Miss Felsham's nervous composure, and the solicitor's measured caution. Each element possessed no obvious crime, yet together they resembled the half-seen outline of something larger, like a shadow on the blind whose figure could not yet be named. Purbright considered Grope first. A man of bluff appetite, accustomed to bending rules with jovial ease, Grope was not above little liberties, but burglary seemed beyond his ambition. His unease, however, was real enough, and unease was rarely born of nothing. To Purbright, the alderman looked less the author of this drama than its unwilling subject. He carried the air of a man whose affairs contained some detail best left unseen. Mrs. Grope, by contrast, had shown no anxiety, only a cold detachment that suggested knowledge of her husband's bluster and little faith in it. Her remark about secrets within households carried, perhaps more precision than she intended. There was in her tone the faint bitterness of one long accustomed to endurance. Then there was Lucy Felsham. She struck Purbright as intelligent, controlled, but not immune to pressure. Her uncle's desk, locked even when empty, suggested a habit of concealment. Families in Flaxborough, Purbright mused, were adept at carrying small scandals through generations, treating them as heirlooms. It was entirely possible that the key belonged to some hidden compartment of that desk or to another object passed quietly with the estate. If so, who placed it in the raffle box, and why? He drew gently upon his pipe, letting the thought expand. The gesture was curious, placing the key where a room full of notables must witness it. Not an act of stealth, but of theatre. Someone wanted to provoke recognition. Someone wished to stir unease in Grope, or perhaps in others too. Such public gestures were rare in Flaxborough, where mischief usually preferred shadows. This one carried purpose, a desire not simply to unlock, but to expose. Purbright's mind returned to the solicitor, Pythock. His restraint, his careful refusal to speculate, carried the patina of professionalism, but it also guarded something. Solicitors in small towns often knew more than their clients wished them to. Pythock's eyes, cool and unreadable, had lingered upon the key longer than necessary. Was it mere curiosity or recognition? Beyond individuals, Purbright reflected upon the town itself. Flaxborough, like all provincial communities, thrived on appearances, shop windows well-dressed, curtains properly drawn, names untarnished by scandal. Yet behind these facades lay the usual blend of vanity, jealousy, and ambition. The Rotary dinner, with its speeches and raffles, was itself a ritual of reassurance, proof that the pillars of the town stood firm. The sudden eruption of an inexplicable object upon their table had been more than a puzzle. It was a disruption of the very fabric by which they measured respectability. The inspector considered the psychology of such disruption. People were swift to seize upon Harbottle not because they truly believed him guilty, but because his notoriety offered them a way to patch the tear. Better to ascribe mischief to a mischievous clerk than to contemplate that one of their own, a pillar of the town, might be signalling secrets in such a dramatic fashion. He leaned back, watching the smoke curl into the lamplight. In Flaxborough, truth rarely announced itself with trumpets. It crept out in blushes, in slips of the tongue, in odd purchases of ribbon and serviettes dropped at inconvenient moments. He thought again of Grope's fumbling, of Mrs. Grope's sharpness, of Lucy Felsham's hesitation. None proved guilt, but together they formed a pattern of discomfort. And discomfort, in Purbright's experience, was the soil in which secrets sprouted. The break-in, too, required reflection. Why force? Open the desk in so clumsy a manner? If the intruder sought documents, were they taken? Or had the desk already been emptied, the burglary staged only to misdirect? Purbright suspected the latter possibility. He had seen before how respectable men, cornered by whispers, contrived accidents to explain away what they dared not admit. It was tempting to believe Grope himself had arranged the break-in, but Purbright was cautious of easy conclusions. The alderman's vanity was strong, but his craft was weak. He would sooner be bluster than plot. If someone had indeed sought to pry open the past, Grope was likely its target, not its engineer. Purbright rose at length, crossed to his desk, and turned the brass key once more in his hand. Its chipped glass gleamed faintly in the lamplight, cheap and gaudy, yet oddly dignified by age. He weighed it in his palm. Objects carried histories, silent but stubborn, and this one clearly refused to rest. It had been meant for display, for discovery, for the very purpose. It now served to stir unease until the truth surfaced. Replacing it carefully, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. He was in no hurry. Time, in Flaxborough, was a generous ally. Secrets, once prodded, ripened of their own accord. All that was required was patience, and patience was the inspector's most faithful tool. He doused the lamp and drew the curtains. Outside, the town settled into its nightly rhythm dogs barking faintly in distant yards, the last bus rumbling away, the clock of St. Swithin's tolling the hour. To any passer-by, Flaxborough lay at peace. Yet Purbright, with the calm certainty of long practice, knew that peace in such towns was only ever the thinnest of veneers. Beneath it, the little vanities and the large anxieties churned quietly, waiting for the hand that would lift the lid. And now that the hand had begun to move, he was resolved to follow its every gesture. For the riddle of the Rotary Club had ceased to be a curiosity. It was becoming, in its quiet, provincial way, a reckoning. Inspector Purbright, having turned over in his mind the jumble of unease and contradiction that seemed to radiate from the alderman's desk and the brass key, resolved that the time had come for a little experiment. It was not in his manner to pounce. He preferred the more leisurely art of creating circumstances in which people revealed themselves. If pressed too directly, Flaxborough's citizens stiffened like hedgehogs. Better to coax them out, to let their own words and gestures betray what lay underneath. The opportunity presented itself in the form of the monthly council luncheon, a ritual of overcooked beef, tepid sherry, and speeches that resembled sermons in both length and penitential effect. Purbright accepted an invitation to attend an unusual occurrence, which in itself stirred curiosity among the members. The alderman, accustomed to regarding the police force as a useful but distant mechanism, eyed the inspector with both unease and pride, as if his presence lent their meal the gravitas of a royal visit. He chose his seat with apparent carelessness, but in truth arranged matters so that he found himself between Alderman Grope and the solicitor Pythock. Conversation flowed in the usual manner, complaints about taxation, reflections upon the weather, half-hearted praise for the soup. Purbright contributed sparingly, his tone mild, his attention apparently wandering. It was when the plates of beef arrived that he struck his first small note. "One wonders," he remarked, turning to Grope as though from idle curiosity, "what becomes of the papers one finds in old desks?" "Curious things sometimes. Receipts, letters, even wills. One never knows what a drawer might hold." The effect was immediate, though subtle. Grope's fork paused mid-air, his face flushed slightly, and he laughed louder than the remark deserved. "Old rubbish, Inspector. Nothing of consequence. Why, when I bought that desk at Havelock's, it was empty as a drum." Pythock, on Purbright's other side, lowered his eyes to his plate with the careful neutrality of a man listening too intently. Purbright let the silence hang for a heartbeat longer before smiling faintly and turning the subject to the quality of the beef. The rest of the luncheon passed without incident, yet the inspector left with satisfaction. His test had drawn its first ripple. Grope was anxious and Pythock was wary. Both reactions were more telling than a dozen protestations. In the days that followed, Purbright extended the experiment. He visited Mrs. Grope at her home, ostensibly to inquire about the burglary. Over tea, served in china so delicate it seemed a rebuke to her husband's bluster, he observed her carefully. "It must have been alarming," he said gently, "to find the desk broken into. A household intrusion is never pleasant." She looked at him levelly, her eyes sharp. "Alarming? No, Inspector. Irritating, certainly, but hardly surprising. Secrets, after all, are rarely left undisturbed." The words hung between them. Purbright did not pursue them, merely nodded as though agreeing with a platitude. Yet inwardly he noted how she spoke not of burglars but of secrets, and the faint curl of her lip, almost a smile, suggested that whatever truth had been sought in that desk she already suspected it. He pressed further, though only by indirection. Strange that someone should go to the trouble for so little. Mrs. Grope stirred her tea. Stranger still that anyone should pretend there was so little to find. Purbright allowed the conversation to drift to other matters, but he left the house with the impression that she, at least, would not mourn the exposure of her husband's affairs. His next call was upon Lucy Felsham. He chose his moment carefully, arriving in the afternoon when she was tending to her garden. Standing among the bare autumn stalks, she greeted him with a composure that was slightly too steady. "I wondered," Purbright said conversationally, "whether your uncle ever mentioned why he kept that desk locked. It seems a curious habit for a man with little to hide." Lucy hesitated, then knelt to tug at a weed with unnecessary force. He was a private man. Perhaps he feared his papers might be misread. "Misread," Purbright echoed, his voice neutral. She glanced up quickly as though regretting the word. "You know how people are, Inspector. They make much of little." He smiled. "Indeed, little things do seem to grow in Flaxborough." He left her then, but her tension confirmed what he suspected. The desk had contained more than mere invoices, and its connection to the brass key was no accident. The experiment was working. With each casual remark, with each suggestion that he knew more than he declared, the web of unease tightened. Those who were entangled began to show strain, and strain invariably led to slips. That evening, walking through the square, Purbright paused beneath the lamplight. The drizzle had ceased, leaving the cobbles slick and gleaming. He considered his progress. He had learned little of the precise content of Havelock's desk, but he had learned much of human nature. Grope was clumsy in his evasions, his wife pointed in her disdain, Lucy Felsham tense in her denials, and Pythock cautious to the point of complicity. The riddle of the key was less about what it unlocked than about whose composure it unsettled. Already the inspector could sense the guilty party edging closer to exposure, like a moth circling a flame. All that was needed was a little more patience, a few more tests, and the truth would emerge of its own accord. Purbright resumed his walk, his figure quiet against the lamplight, his mind calm. He was content. The town believed itself still wrapped in mystery, but for him the solution was forming, piece by piece, out of trifles and blushes, and soon enough one more gentle prod would bring the matter to light. The following week found Inspector Purbright presiding, as unobtrusively as he could manage, over a gathering that resembled nothing so much as an ordinary civic consultation. He had arranged the meeting under the pretext of concluding inquiries into the break-in at Grope's shop, inviting a few individuals whose names had, in one way or another, been brushed by the affair. It took place not in the police station, but in the small committee room of the council offices, a setting calculated to feel familiar, almost domestic, to the town's worthies. A long polished table reflected the muted glow of the lamps, and the faint smell of dust and furniture polish lent the air a curious solemnity. Grope arrived first, expansive in waistcoat and nervous in manner, perspiring freely as though his conscience had dressed him in an extra layer. His wife followed with a face composed to neutrality, lips pressed tight enough to suggest displeasure held in check. Pythock, the solicitor, entered next, his briefcase clutched with professional gravity, eyes cool and guarded. Finally came Lucy Felsham, slim, self-contained, a figure of composure that seemed, on closer view, rather brittle. Purbright welcomed them with a politeness that verged on indifference, as though the meeting were a courtesy to satisfy routine rather than a culmination of enquiry. He seated himself at the head of the table, hands folded loosely before him, and spoke in his mild, deliberate way. "I am obliged to you all for attending. The matter of the burglary has naturally caused concern, and it is only proper that certain points should be set in order. I thought it best that we might discuss them together for clarity's sake." He paused, as if considering where to begin, though in truth his plan was carefully arranged. He reached into his pocket and placed the brass key upon the table. Its dull gleam drew each eye to it at once. "This," he said quietly, was introduced into the Rotary raffle box with some deliberation. Not by accident, and certainly not by mischief alone. It was meant to be seen, and by particular persons present that night. Grope shifted heavily in his chair, muttering about pranks and young fellows with nothing better to do. Purbright ignored the interruption, his eyes resting instead upon Lucy Felsham. "Miss Felsham," he continued gently, "your late uncle was a man of private habits. He kept his desk locked, even when empty, but it was not empty, was it?" Lucy's hands tightened in her lap. For a moment she seemed about to protest, then thought better of it. Her silence was more eloquent than denial. Purbright allowed the moment to settle before going on. The desk, as sold at auction, had been stripped of its lock. The escutcheon plate was discarded, and yet the key remained retained, one might say, by someone who wished its existence known. It was placed in the raffle box not to mystify the town, but to alarm those who recognized it. He turned his gaze upon Grope, who coloured deeply and began to bluster. "Nonsense, Inspector. A rusty trinket, nothing more." But Purbright's voice, calm and steady, pressed on. "The breaking at your shop, Alderman, was not the work of vagrants. It was an attempt, whether by yourself or another, to create the impression that whatever papers the desk had once contained were gone, destroyed, and meaningless. Yet the haste with which you purchased the desk and the anxiety you displayed when the key appeared suggest otherwise. Some believed the contents dangerous enough to warrant concealment, and others believed them worth uncovering. The alderman sputtered, appealing to Pythock for support. The solicitor cleared his throat with professional delicacy. "Inspector, I must remind you that certain matters of estate are bound by confidentiality. My late client, Mr. Havelock, entrusted me with documents which, though not illegal, might have proved inconvenient. Were they to circulate?" "Precisely," Purbright said, his tone still courteous. "Inconvenient to whom, Mr. Pythock?" The solicitor's eyes flickered momentarily toward Grope. That glance, fleeting as it was, told the story. Purbright continued, addressing the table, as though delivering a calm summation at a parish meeting. "Mr. Havelock, in his later years, recorded certain financial dealings of the town's notable debts, arrangements, guarantees of a nature not intended for public view. Among them, Alderman, were references to transactions of your own, transactions that might, in a less charitable light, be described as misappropriations." Grope surged forward in his chair, sweating, protesting, yet his wife's still face gave him no support. Her eyes rested upon him with a coldness that suggested knowledge long endured. Lucy Felsham's composure wavered too. She spoke at last, her voice low but firm. "My uncle was no saint, Inspector. He enjoyed collecting knowledge of others' failings. But he wished, before he died, that certain truths should not remain forever hidden. He entrusted me with the key." I faltered slightly, then continued. "I placed it in the raffle box. I knew it would be recognized. I meant only to provoke honesty, not theft." The room held its breath. Grope's protests grew weaker, his bluster collapsing under the weight of her quiet statement. Pythock closed his briefcase with the slow finality of a man resigned to unpleasant disclosures. Mrs. Grope sat straighter, her expression almost serene, as though vindicated at last. Purbright inclined his head gently. "Then it is clear. The riddle was not a prank, nor a mystery for its own sake, but a signal. The key was intended to remind certain gentlemen that secrets, however well locked, have a way of finding their way into the open." He gathered the key, slipped it back into his pocket, and rose. "I see no purpose in further noise. Matters of law may or may not follow, that is for others to decide. My duty was to understand the nature of this little drama. I believe I do." He thanked them with grave politeness and ushered them out, leaving behind the lingering silence of a room where masks had slipped, and the truth, politely but firmly, had been laid upon the table. The town of Flaxborough, having endured its moment of high mystery with a mixture of relish and apprehension, settled once more into its customary rhythm. The market resumed its low-level quarrels over vegetable prices, Mrs. Clegg's tea-room hosted the same parade of gossipers, and the Railway Arms returned to the safer territory of debating football fixtures rather than coded conspiracies. Yet something lingered, a faint aftertaste, as though the brass key still turned quietly in the minds of those who had witnessed its drama. The Rotary Club, mortified by the notoriety that had attached itself to their raffle, attempted to erase the incident by means of exaggerated formality. Minutes were recorded with such precision that even the order in which spoons were dropped was solemnized, and the next raffle consisted only of tickets purchased and drawn under supervision that might have satisfied a Treasury auditor. Still, whenever the ballot box was produced, more than one pair of eyes darted toward it with nervous recollection. Alderman Grope, though not disgraced in any official sense, found his once boisterous presence diminished. His laughter grew forced, his shoulders stooped a little, and his trade suffered as customers, without ever saying why, drifted to other drapers. His wife carried herself with a new, chilly dignity, as if confirmed in a judgment long held, and the town accorded her a sympathy that was half respect, half curiosity. Lucy Felsham resumed her quiet life, tending her garden, attending church, and moving with a reserve that kept speculation at bay. Yet she was regarded differently now, with the cautious respect granted to someone who had proven capable of unsettling the established order with a single, deliberate act. In her presence, people spoke more carefully, as though she might hold a key to other locks still unopened. As for Python, he remained what he had always been, a solicitor, whose chief talent lay in knowing when silence was preferable to speech. He gave nothing away, and the town, sensing his knowledge but never prizing it free, treated him with the wary politeness one affords a man who might know too much. Through it all, Inspector Purbright made no speeches, wrote no reports more dramatic than a routine entry, and accepted no thanks. He moved quietly through the town, a figure of unhurried courtesy, whose interest seemed to lie more in the ordering of his paperwork than in the small commotions he had so deftly untangled. One evening, a week after the gathering at the council offices, he sat alone in his office as dusk settled across the square. The brass key lay upon his desk, its chipped red glass glinting faintly in the lamplight. He turned it once in his fingers, then placed it into an envelope, marking it with nothing more dramatic than property retain. There it would rest, filed among 100 other objects whose stories had disturbed Flaxborough briefly before the town folded back into its customary quiet. Purbright leaned back, gazing out at the lamplighters moving steadily along the street, their poles touching flame to glass. The town was resuming its calm, and he felt no need to disturb it further. Secrets had been hinted at, reputations adjusted, order restored not by thunder or scandal, but by the quiet inevitability with which truth, however small, eventually insists upon being noticed. He drew a sheet of paper toward him, dipped his pen, and began upon the evening's paperwork, his face composed in its usual mask of mild patience. For Inspector Purbright, this too was resolution, the return to routine, the steady rhythm of quiet duty after the faint tremors of human folly had once again revealed themselves, then passed. Outside the square grew still, the town wrapped itself in darkness, and the mystery of the Rotary Club key faded into memory, never entirely forgotten, but absorbed into that curious tapestry of half-remembered scandal that gave Flaxborough its flavour. And in his office, Inspector Purbright, calm as ever, bent once more to his writing.